This is a brief guide to problems and diagnoses and how best to enter them in the most efficient way. So there are two main ways of entering this information. It can be done from within the problem list here, which is part of the workflow end page, and this is the most efficient way of entering this data, or it can be done in the traditional way through the problems and diagnosis tabs. I'm going to start off with the problem list, and the first thing to do, which to try and resolve some confusion that sometimes occurs, is what exactly do we mean by problems and diagnoses, because different people sometimes interpret different things. In the traditional problems and diagnosis terminology within EPR, diagnosis is, as you'd expect, a diagnosis related to this admission, so the specific cause of admission, whereas a problem is a long-standing issue which we usually refer to as past medical history or comorbidities. In the problem list setup, this has changed slightly, and they've changed, hopefully made it a little bit more straightforward. They've got this visit and chronic. So a patient this patient has come in with a pulmonary embolism. This patient also has asthma, which is presumably a long-standing problem, chronic medical history, so that needs to be ticked. And this implies that an exacerbation of the asthma was contributed to this admission, was part of the current diagnosis, or indeed that it was a new diagnosis on this admission. Or if I've entered this incorrectly, and actually I meant to enter this as a chronic problem when I typed in asthma in the first place, I should have had it in chronic, but I made a mistake. All I need to do now is untick this visit and it will correct that. And you see that asthma is now a long-standing problem, not related to this admission, and the current admission is due to pulmonary embolism and musculoskeletal chest pain. Similarly, if this is the wrong diagnosis, or this is my provisional diagnosis and I now want to correct it, I can click on this visit and pulmonary embolism will be removed. This patient also has a chronic problem of COPD. I'm going to add in now that this patient has also got anemia. If I just type it in here directly, as you can see that the diagnosis comes up very rapidly, and I can select the appropriate one, just press enter, and the diagnosis of anemia will come up very shortly. Similarly, the patient is also known to have diabetes, which is clearly a long-standing problem. So I'm going to type in diabetes here, look for diabetes mellitus, and that will appear in the chronic problem. It's also worth pointing out that this tool here also has Google search functionality, so typing in diabetes brought me up a whole load of different options, but actually if I type partial of both words, then my search becomes much more rapid. Similarly, if I'm looking for myocardial infarction, I get all sorts of odd things. I don't want myoclonia or myoclonus, but if I put in inf rather than having to type in the whole of myocardial infarction, it's a much more rapid search process. If the chronic problem resolves, clearly diabetes is unlikely to do so, but then I can resolve it here. And then if I do that now, if I resolve the diabetes, you will see it will appear under historical, so it's always kept within the record. So it's clearly crucial that appropriate diagnoses are entered, because this is what will provide the record both for the current record, for the future, and also will populate the discharge summary. And the population of these chronic items of the past medical history is crucial again for information for the team looking after that patient, but also crucial for coding, because if you have a patient come in with a diagnosis of pulmonary embolism, this is very clear for coders who can then code it, we can get paid. But if the patient also has diabetes and COPD and other frailty issues, they can code them, and then the hospital can bill for a much larger amount. So there are all sorts of reasons why it is crucial that you get this information in. Also, anything that's entered as a chronic problem, i.e. past medical history, will automatically carry through into the record next time the patient is admitted or when the patient is seen in outpatients. So this will also save a huge amount of time. If we go to the Problems and Diagnoses tab, the same information is displayed here. It's entering the data is a little bit more time consuming. If I put in fibromyalgia here, I then search for it, select it, and it gets entered. So it's a little slower, but the same process. Similarly, it's also worth pointing out for problems, we have some folders down here. This thing here called the flag is what prompts the system to identify whether there is a star on many of the lists, and it's an alert flag. So we have alerts that are patient at risk, safeguarding issues, infection risks, and if you select those problems from here, from the alerts folders, so for example, I have patient at risk, this patient is a vulnerable adult. If I put that in there and click OK, then when we come back to the problem list, if I refresh this now, you will see that those two diagnoses that I've entered will appear, and that the vulnerable adult has flagged as patient at risk. Again, I can resolve that and it will appear in histories. So the only final point is to show you that in the discharge process, these diagnoses do not currently appear, and that is because if I go into this diagnosis here, this diagnosis has a diagnosis type of admitting, and for a discharge summary it has to be a discharging diagnosis. So I can either change that here, I can modify that within the workflow M page and change this to an admitting diagnosis to a discharge diagnosis. I can do it from the Problems and Diagnosis tab, again a little bit slower. I could change this admitting diagnosis to a discharge diagnosis and save, or in the depart process, now that I've done those two, they've come through already, and if I want to add another one in, I also want to put in the anemia, I can modify that and make it a discharge diagnosis. So I now have 3 discharge diagnoses. So this additional step might seem a little irritating, but it's really crucial, as it's the final prompt and last chance for you to check that the diagnoses that you're entering are actually correct, rather than provisional diagnoses that have subsequently been modified. So that's how you change your diagnoses, and just to show you now that these diagnoses appear on the doctor's work list, as do the problems. So I hope that's useful.